Everyone knows Chumlee as the funny, easygoing guy from the hit TV show Pawn Stars. He's the one always joking around, getting into silly situations and making everyone laugh. But what most people don't know is how he ended up there in the first place. His journey from a small pawn shop worker to becoming one of the most loved faces on television is not just surprising, it's almost unbelievable. Chumlee's real name is Austin Lee Russell, but very few people ever call him that. The name Chumlee actually came from a cartoon character that people thought he looked like. He wasn't born into fame and he didn't grow up rich. He was just a regular kid living in Las Vegas, Nevada. Life wasn't easy, but he had a big personality even back then. He loved making people laugh and he always stood out in a crowd. Even as a kid, Chumlee had a different way of seeing the world. Before TV, he worked at the Gold and Silver Pawn Shop, which was owned by Rick Harrison and his family. Chumlee had been friends with Rick's son Corey since they were kids. That connection helped him get the job at the shop. At first, he did the usual behind-the-scenes work. He wasn't the expert in old coins or fancy antiques. He was more like the guy who kept things moving. But even in those early days, people around him noticed something special. He had a way of making people smile even when things were stressful. And he always brought a fun energy wherever he went. When Pawn Stars started as a reality TV show, it was meant to show the business side of the pawn shop, how items are bought and sold, how history connects to everyday objects, and how people try to make a deal. But what surprised everyone was how much the audience loved Chumlee. He wasn't supposed to be the star. In fact, he was just supposed to be part of the background. But viewers connected with him almost immediately. His silly questions, funny mistakes, and goofy attitude made him stand out from the rest of the cast. Soon Chumlee became more than just comic relief. People started tuning in just to see what he would do next. He brought balance to the show. While Rick was the serious expert and Corey was the straight-faced negotiator, Chumlee was the wild card. And the producers noticed this. They started giving him more screen time. His role grew with every season. And just like that, Chumlee became a household name. With fame came money, and for someone who never expected to be famous, it was life-changing. Chumlee started earning thousands per episode. He began enjoying the high life, fancy cars, expensive shoes, private parties. On social media, fans could see his new lifestyle, photos with celebrities, vacations, luxury watches. It looked like a dream come true. But behind the scenes, things were not as perfect as they seemed. Fame can change people, and Chumlee was no exception. As his popularity grew, so did the pressure. He wasn't just a pawn shop worker anymore. He was a celebrity. People expected him to always be funny, always be entertaining. That kind of stress takes a toll. And for someone like Chumlee, who was never trained for fame, it started to show. Still, his fan base stayed strong. No matter what happened, people still loved him. Maybe it was because he felt real. Unlike other celebrities who seemed distant or fake, Chumlee felt like someone you could sit down with and have a burger. He wasn't trying to act like a star, he was just being himself. That honesty, that sense of he's just like us, kept people watching. But here's where things take a curious turn. How does someone who became so famous so fast start slipping into trouble? Why did things begin to fall apart? Was it the pressure of fame? Was it the people he surrounded himself with? Or was it something deeper, something from before he ever stepped onto a TV set? The truth is, Chumlee's rise to fame was fast, but his personal growth didn't always keep up. With money and fame came new friends, some of whom may not have had the best influence. He started getting involved in things that weren't part of his life before. The fun-loving goofball people saw on TV started facing serious problems off camera. And that's where the story starts getting darker, leading to legal trouble, court cases, and a shocking moment that would leave fans speechless. But that's part of what makes Chumlee's story so gripping. It's not just about fame and success, it's about how quickly things can change. How someone who made millions laugh can find himself in a courtroom, facing the toughest moment of his life. And yet through it all, people still want to know. What happened to the Chumlee they loved? Can he come back from it? Or is this where the story ends? That's the hook that keeps people watching, keeps them searching, and keeps them asking questions. Because when someone rises so high and falls so hard, the story isn't just entertainment, it's human. When people saw Chumlee on TV, they saw someone funny, lighthearted, and full of jokes. He made people laugh without even trying too hard. To the world, he looked happy. But behind that smile, there were things that most people never saw. There were moments of sadness, stress, and confusion that Chumlee kept hidden from the cameras. He became famous so fast that he didn't really get the time to stop and think about how his life was changing. Fame can be exciting, but it also comes with problems. One day you're just a regular person. The next day, millions of people know your name, want pictures with you, and follow everything you do. It sounds like a dream, but it can be very overwhelming. For Chumlee, it wasn't easy to deal with this sudden change. He went from working in a small pawn shop to being watched by fans from all over the world. People laughed when he made mistakes on the show, but he started to feel like maybe they were laughing at him, not with him. When you become famous, people expect you to be the same every day. Always funny, always happy. But no one can be that way all the time. Chumlee started to feel pressure. He didn't want to disappoint anyone, so he tried to keep the fun image alive. But inside, he was struggling. He was dealing with stress, anxiety, and a lot of confusion about who he really was. He didn't talk about it openly at the time because many people think that if you're famous, you shouldn't complain. As he became richer, he started buying expensive things. He got fancy cars, designer clothes, and even built a huge collection of sneakers. On the outside, it looked like he was living his best life. But sometimes people buy things to feel better inside. It's like trying to fill a hole. Chumlee once said in an interview that he used to feel empty, and shopping made him feel like he had control. That's a big clue that something wasn't right. Along with shopping and fame, another problem started to grow: his health. Chumlee struggled with weight issues for years. On the show, it became a running joke, and people often made fun of how he looked. Even though he laughed along, those comments hurt him deeply. He began trying different diets and sometimes even stayed away from the show to focus on getting healthy. But it wasn't just about the physical weight, it was the emotional weight too. The kind that no one could see. There were also rumors and whispers about his lifestyle. Some said he started partying too much. Others talked about bad influences around him. Friends who weren't really friends, people who used his fame for their own gain. It's hard to stay grounded when everyone around you is telling you how great you are. Chumlee began trusting the wrong people. He found himself in situations that were risky and dangerous. And all of this was happening while he was still showing up on TV, smiling and cracking jokes. The truth is, Chumlee was living two lives. In one, he was the goofy TV star everyone loved. In the other, he was a man slowly losing control. He tried to balance both, but the second life started to catch up with him. His habits changed. His mood changed, and slowly people close to him started to notice. But by the time they realized how serious things were, it was almost too late. What makes this part of Chumlee's story so sad is that it could have happened to anyone. He didn't grow up thinking he would be famous. He didn't have a team of people teaching him how to handle fame, money, or pressure. He was just a regular guy who became a star almost by accident. And when life started moving too fast, he didn't know how to slow it down. People around him started to worry. They saw him getting involved with things that didn't match who he was before. There were late nights, strange behavior, and moments when he seemed lost. Even his fans noticed changes in him. Some of them left comments online, asking if he was okay. Others didn't care. They just wanted to be entertained. That's one of the hardest things about being famous. When you're in pain, people still expect you to perform. And then the breaking point came. It wasn't one big moment, but a series of small choices that led to bigger problems. Things that started as harmless fun turned into serious mistakes. He was no longer just the funny guy on TV. He was now part of something much more serious. Something that would lead him straight into a courtroom. But before we get to that part, it's important to understand this: Chumlee wasn't a bad person. He was a person who got lost. He was someone who didn't ask for the spotlight, but tried to survive in it, and while the world was laughing at his jokes, he was quietly breaking down inside. That's why this chapter of his life is so important. It shows us that fame doesn't fix everything. It doesn't erase pain or make life perfect. In fact, it often makes things harder. Chumlee had the money, the cars, the fans, but what he really needed was peace. And he didn't know where to find it. The story of Chumlee's struggles makes people ask questions. How many other celebrities are smiling on the outside but hurting on the inside? How many fans notice the signs but ignore them? And most of all, could things have been different if someone had stepped in sooner? These are the questions that stay with you. They make you want to know more. They make you wonder what's going to happen next. Because once someone falls this far, the real story isn't about how they fell. It's about whether they can get back up. Chumlee's life, which had once seemed so perfect, started to crumble when he found himself facing serious legal trouble. It was the kind of thing no one saw coming. The fun-loving guy who everyone knew from Pawn Stars was suddenly caught in a storm that would change everything. How did it all happen? What went wrong? What caused Chumlee to go from being a beloved TV personality to being at the center of a criminal investigation? This part of his story is not just about mistakes or bad decisions. It's about how fast everything can fall apart, even for someone who never asked for this kind of attention. The trouble began with a search. It wasn't something that happened overnight, but it built up over time. Chumlee had always been open about his life. He posted on social media, shared moments with his fans, and allowed people into his world. But behind the scenes, not everything was as innocent as it seemed. Chumlee had been involved in activities that were not only risky but also illegal. It wasn't something he talked about publicly. But the authorities knew. And one day, everything came to a head. It all started with a tip. Someone close to Chumlee had raised concerns, and it wasn't long before law enforcement began looking into him. The tip was about drugs. It was about the kind of substances that no one expects to be part of a celebrity's life, let alone someone like Chumlee who seemed so down to earth and fun. The police started to gather evidence, and soon they had enough to search Chumlee's home. This is when things started to get serious. He was no longer just the guy who made people laugh. He was now the subject of an investigation. The day of the search, Chumlee's life changed forever. The police arrived at his home and conducted a search that revealed much more than anyone expected. They found items that suggested Chumlee was involved in illegal activities. This wasn't just about some bad decisions. This was about things that could have serious consequences. The police found drugs, weapons, and even evidence suggesting that Chumlee had been part of something far more dangerous than anyone imagined. His fans were shocked. The man who made jokes on TV, who seemed so harmless, was now facing charges that could change his life in an instant. It wasn't just about what was found in his house. It was about the aftermath of the investigation. Chumlee's name was suddenly everywhere, but not for the reasons he was used to. He wasn't being talked about because of his role on Pawn Stars. Instead, his name was linked to something much darker. News outlets were covering his story, fans were asking questions, and people were wondering how someone who seemed so innocent could be involved in such serious matters. The pressure was overwhelming. For the first time, Chumlee wasn't just the funny guy on TV, he was a man whose life was on the line. The investigation didn't stop at just the search. Chumlee was arrested and charged with possession of illegal substances, and he was facing some very serious consequences. At first it seemed like it might be just a bad situation he could bounce back from. After all, many celebrities had faced similar problems and managed to come out on top. But as the legal process went on, it became clear that things were more complicated than anyone had thought. The charges against him were severe, and the stakes were higher than ever. Chumlee's friends and family were in shock. They knew that he had his struggles, but no one expected this. They didn't know the full extent of what was going on behind the scenes, and they certainly didn't think it would lead to something like this. They tried to support him, but the situation seemed out of control. Chumlee had to face the reality of what he was up against, the possibility of jail time, the loss of his career, and the damage to his reputation. And all of this was happening so quickly. His whole world, which had once been filled with laughter and fame, was now clouded with doubt and uncertainty. As the court case moved forward, the public started to see more of the truth. The charges against Chumlee were serious, and it seemed like his career could be over. But even through all the media attention and the stress, there was a part of Chumlee that still believed he could turn things around. He had made mistakes, but he wasn't a bad person. He knew that he had to face the consequences of his actions, but at the same time, he didn't want this to define who he was forever. What happened next was unexpected. Chumlee didn't just go down without a fight. He started taking steps to fix his life. He went to rehab and tried to get his life back on track. He realized that fame wasn't everything. It wasn't about the cars, the shoes, or the luxury. It was about being true to himself. And maybe, just maybe, this legal storm could be the wake-up call he needed to change. He couldn't go back and undo the mistakes he had made, but he could try to build a better future. The legal battle wasn't over, but he was starting to see that this was the moment to make a choice. Would he continue down a dangerous path, or would he make the changes he needed to survive? As the case continued, there was still so much uncertainty. Would Chumlee be found guilty? What would happen to his career and his reputation? The questions were endless, but at the same time, there was a feeling of hope. Maybe this wasn't the end of Chumlee's story. Maybe it was just a turning point. Fans and even people who had never watched Pawn Stars started to root for him. They saw him not just as a celebrity, but as a person who made mistakes, learned from them, and was trying to be better. The public was starting to give him a chance at redemption, but it was clear that it wouldn't be easy. And that's what makes this part of Chumlee's story so important. It's a reminder that fame doesn't protect you from making mistakes. It doesn't shield you from the consequences of your actions, but it also shows that even when things seem hopeless, there's always a chance to turn things around. Chumlee wasn't the only one going through struggles, and his story became one of many that people could relate to. He wasn't just a star on TV anymore. He was someone who had to face real-life challenges, and that made him even more human. The courtroom was filled with tension, and the air was thick with uncertainty. Everyone knew that this was a critical moment in Chumlee's life. He wasn't just sitting there as a spectator or a TV personality anymore. He was facing real consequences, and the future of his career and his life was at stake. What had once been a funny, light-hearted reality show about a pawn shop was now a backdrop to a legal drama that no one could have predicted. The man who made people laugh on TV was now fighting for his freedom. Chumlee walked into the courtroom, surrounded by his legal team, his family, and a few close friends. The room was silent, except for the sound of murmured conversations from the people in the audience. Some people were there out of curiosity, wanting to see the famous Chumlee in person. Others, however, were waiting to see if he would walk away from this hearing with his life intact, or if this would be the beginning of the end for him. The stakes were high, and it felt like the world was watching. The prosecutor stood up and laid out the charges against him. The courtroom was filled with the seriousness of the situation. These weren't just minor issues. The charges were serious: possession of drugs, weapons, and other illegal items. The evidence had been collected, and it wasn't looking good for Chumlee. The prosecutor painted a picture of a man who had lost control, someone who had gone down a dangerous path, and was now facing the consequences. The words hung in the air, and it was hard for anyone in the room to ignore the gravity of what was happening. Chumlee, sitting in his chair, listened quietly as his lawyer tried to defend him. There was a sense of disbelief in his eyes, as if he still couldn't believe he had found himself here. How did things go so wrong? It was hard to imagine that just a few years earlier, he had been a beloved star on one of the most popular TV shows in the country. How had he ended up in a courtroom, fighting for his future? The thoughts raced through his mind, but he didn't show them. He kept a calm exterior, trying to maintain his composure. But everyone could tell that this wasn't just a legal case for him. This was a battle for his life. As the case continued, the evidence began to pile up. The police had found illegal substances in his home. They had found weapons. They had found evidence that suggested Chumlee had been involved in activities that could lead to serious criminal charges. It was hard to deny the facts, and even Chumlee knew that the situation wasn't looking great. He wasn't the innocent guy everyone had thought he was. The person who appeared on TV every week was now standing in front of a judge, facing the harsh reality of his actions. But despite the overwhelming evidence, there was still something in Chumlee that fought back. He wasn't ready to give up, not yet. His legal team worked hard to try and find any way out of this situation, any way to lessen the impact of the charges. Chumlee's defense attorney made it clear that while Chumlee had made mistakes, he wasn't a criminal at heart. He wasn't a violent person. The items found in his home didn't necessarily mean he was involved in a dangerous lifestyle. He had simply made bad decisions. The defense tried to argue that Chumlee wasn't the mastermind behind everything, that he had been a victim of the circumstances and the people he had surrounded himself with. But the case wasn't as simple as that. Then, in a surprising turn of events, Chumlee's lawyer asked for a moment of leniency. They asked the judge to consider Chumlee's character. They painted a picture of a man who had grown up with a love for history and had worked hard to achieve his success. They reminded the court that Chumlee had been a positive figure for millions of fans, that he had shown kindness and humor in a way that resonated with so many people. They asked the judge to take into account the fact that Chumlee had already begun making efforts to improve his life. He had gone to rehab. He had acknowledged his mistakes. He had even started to make changes before the court case began. Wasn't this evidence that he was willing to change? There was a pause in the courtroom. The judge took a long look at Chumlee. This wasn't just about legal technicalities anymore. This was about redemption. Could this man who had once brought joy to millions of people find a way back from his mistakes? Was he someone who could be forgiven and given a chance to turn his life around? The judge seemed to weigh the situation carefully. This wasn't an easy decision, and everyone in the room could feel the tension. The prosecutor, however, wasn't so willing to let go. They reminded the court that Chumlee wasn't just a celebrity who could be excused for his actions. The law had to apply to everyone equally, regardless of their fame or status. The prosecutor argued that the charges against Chumlee were serious, and if they weren't dealt with properly, it could send the wrong message. They argued that fame couldn't be an excuse for breaking the law, and that Chumlee had to face the consequences, no matter how much he had entertained people on TV. The words were harsh, but they were true. And the courtroom knew that. It felt like the room was holding its breath, as the judge prepared to make a decision. Chumlee had spent so much of his life making people laugh, but now he was facing the most serious challenge of his life. His career, his reputation, his freedom, everything was on the line. What would happen next? Would the judge show mercy, or would the legal system come down hard on him, no matter how much people loved him? Then the judge spoke. The decision wasn't what Chumlee had hoped for. The judge decided that Chumlee would be sentenced to probation and would have to pay a fine, but there was no jail time. The judge recognized that Chumlee had made mistakes, but also saw that he was trying to make amends. He was given a chance, but it wasn't the easy way out. This was the moment that would define Chumlee's future. He had been given a second chance, but it was up to him to take it. As the courtroom cleared, Chumlee walked out with his legal team, feeling a mix of relief and fear. The case was over, but the battle was just beginning. He knew he had a long road ahead of him, filled with challenges. But now more than ever, he understood the value of the second chance he had been given. Could he change? Could he rebuild his life? That was the big question everyone would be watching him answer. After the courtroom drama and the tension of the legal battle, Chumlee found himself at a crossroads. His second chance wasn't just about staying out of jail, it was about rebuilding his life, his career, and his reputation. For years, Chumlee had been known as the funny, laid-back guy from Pawn Stars, the one who made everyone laugh without trying too hard. But now, he was faced with the question of whether he could rebuild that image or whether the mistakes he made would forever define him. This was more than just a fresh start, it was a chance to prove to himself and to the world that he could learn from his past and become a better person. When the judge handed down the sentence, it wasn't exactly a clean slate. Chumlee was given probation and had to pay a fine. While it was a relief that he didn't face jail time, it was also clear that this wasn't an easy way out. He had to work hard to prove that he was worthy of this second chance. He couldn't just go back to his old ways. He had to show that he was serious about making things right. He knew the eyes of the world were on him, waiting to see if he would fall back into the same patterns or rise above them. For Chumlee, the first step was facing the truth. He had made mistakes and he knew that he couldn't pretend they didn't happen. He wasn't just a victim of bad decisions, he was the one who made those choices. But instead of hiding from his mistakes, he decided to face them head-on. He took responsibility for what he had done, acknowledging that his actions had consequences not just for him, but for the people who cared about him. He didn't want to be defined by his past anymore. He wanted to take control of his future, and that meant being honest with himself and with the people who had supported him all along. One of the biggest challenges for Chumlee was overcoming the public perception of him. He had been a beloved character on Pawn Stars, but now he was the subject of media gossip, judgment, and criticism. The fame that had once been a source of joy and excitement now felt like a burden. Everywhere he went, people were talking about his past mistakes. His name was no longer just associated with the TV show. It was linked to drugs, weapons, and legal troubles. It wasn't easy to deal with this shift in public opinion. The hardest part was knowing that people who had once admired him were now questioning his character. But Chumlee didn't let this stop him. He knew that if he wanted to rebuild his life, he had to start by focusing on what he could control. The first thing he did was focus on his health. He had struggled with his weight and his well-being for years, but now he made a commitment to take better care of himself. He started exercising regularly, eating healthier, and working on his mental health as well. He went to therapy to help him process everything that had happened. He knew that in order to move forward, he had to take care of himself first. Chumlee's next step was to reconnect with the people who mattered most to him. He had distanced himself from family and friends during some of the toughest times in his life, but now he understood the importance of having a support system. He spent more time with his family, seeking their advice and support. He reconnected with old friends who had always been there for him, and he started to build new relationships based on trust and honesty. He understood that he couldn't make this journey alone. He needed people who would help him stay on track and remind him of who he really was. In the public eye, Chumlee slowly started to regain the trust of his fans. He wasn't trying to pretend that everything was okay or that his past didn't matter. Instead, he was open about his struggles. He talked about the challenges he faced and the lessons he had learned. He shared his journey on social media, allowing his followers to see that he was working hard to improve himself. People began to notice the change. They saw that Chumlee was serious about making things right, and many began to support him again. It wasn't an easy road, but he had learned that redemption wasn't about perfection. It was about making the effort to be better, day by day. One of the biggest changes in Chumlee's life came when he returned to Pawn Stars. After his legal issues, there were questions about whether he would continue to be a part of the show. Fans wondered if he would be welcomed back or if his past would keep him from returning to the TV screen. Chumlee was nervous, but he was also determined. He knew that this was a chance to show people that he had grown and that he was still the same guy they had loved on the show, just a little more aware of his mistakes and how to avoid them in the future. When he returned to Pawn Stars, it wasn't just about the fame or the cameras, it was about doing something he loved while showing people that he had learned from his mistakes. The first few episodes back were filled with nervous energy, but Chumlee quickly found his footing. His fans were excited to see him again, and for Chumlee it felt like a moment of redemption. He was able to show the world that he had changed, that he was more than his past mistakes. But even with this success, Chumlee knew that the work wasn't done. Redemption wasn't a one-time thing. It wasn't about just getting through a tough time and then moving on. It was about making a long-term commitment to change. Chumlee continued to take steps to better his life. He kept going to therapy, staying healthy, and working on his relationships. He understood that it was easy to fall back into old habits, but the real challenge was staying on the right path when no one was watching. As time went on, people began to see the new Chumlee. The man who had once been caught up in a whirlwind of fame, drugs, and bad decisions was now someone who had learned from his mistakes. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying. And that's what people admired. They admired his honesty, his willingness to improve, and his determination to be a better person. Chumlee's story became one of hope. It showed that no matter how far you fall, you can always rise again if you're willing to work for it. For Chumlee, redemption was a journey. It wasn't a quick fix, and it wasn't something that would happen overnight. But every step he took, no matter how small, brought him closer to the person he wanted to be. He knew there would still be challenges ahead, but he was ready to face them with the same determination that had carried him through his darkest days. He had learned the hard way that success and fame don't mean anything if you don't take care of yourself and the people who matter. Now, Chumlee was taking care of both, and that was the most important thing. The road to redemption is never easy, and for Chumlee, it was about to get even more difficult. After all the court hearings, after the public scrutiny, and after the long process of trying to rebuild his life, he thought things might calm down. But life, as he had learned, didn't give up easily. There was one more challenge waiting for him. A challenge that would test everything he had worked for. It wasn't about his career, his fame, or his reputation anymore. This time, it was about his very soul, his inner strength, and whether he had the willpower to rise above the darkness that had once consumed him. Chumlee had faced the world in court. He had dealt with the legal system, media pressure, and even the judgment of people who once considered him a friend. Yet as he began to rebuild, something started to feel different. It was no longer the fame or the money that kept him going. It wasn't even about proving everyone wrong. Instead, it was about a deeper personal battle that he had to face. Deep inside, Chumlee was still dealing with the emotional scars of his past. The guilt, the shame, the constant battle to live up to expectations. All of it was still there. And the moment of truth came when he realized he couldn't run from these feelings anymore. He had to face them head-on, or they would keep holding him back. This was when Chumlee realized that true redemption wasn't just about cleaning up your act or staying out of jail. It was about dealing with the parts of yourself that you wish didn't exist. It was about facing the fact that you had hurt people, made bad choices, and maybe even betrayed the trust of those who loved you. But most importantly, it was about healing. Chumlee understood that healing wasn't just about fixing the outward stuff. It was about healing inside, where all the pain, the fear, and the regrets lived. It wasn't an easy decision to confront his inner demons. For so long, Chumlee had kept a lot of these feelings locked away. He'd pushed them down, pretending they didn't matter. He'd gone through the motions of recovery and redemption, but deep inside, he was still struggling. The truth was that Chumlee had been living in a constant state of fear. Fear that his past would come back to haunt him. Fear that he wasn't good enough to move forward. Fear that he would fail. He was constantly fighting an invisible battle, one that no one could see. But there was something different this time. Chumlee felt like he had reached a point in his life where he had no choice but to face his fears. He couldn't continue pretending that everything was fine. He couldn't keep pushing his emotions aside. If he wanted to truly heal and move forward, he had to go deeper. And that meant facing the raw, uncomfortable truth about himself. The first step toward healing was acceptance. Chumlee had to accept that he wasn't perfect. He had to accept that he had made mistakes, and some of those mistakes were really big. He had hurt people, let down his fans, and even betrayed the trust of the people closest to him. But the key to moving forward was realizing that accepting these facts didn't make him a bad person. It simply meant he was human. He had made bad choices, but those choices didn't have to define him forever. They didn't have to be the last chapter in his story. Chumlee learned that accepting his flaws wasn't about giving up. It was about embracing the fact that he was capable of growth, and that growth started with honesty. The next step was the hardest one. Forgiveness. Chumlee had to forgive himself. This was something he hadn't realized he needed until this moment. He had spent so much time beating himself up over his mistakes that he had forgotten how to let go. He was still holding on to the shame and guilt of his past, and it was weighing him down. But in order to move forward, he had to forgive himself. It wasn't easy, but he understood that holding on to guilt would only keep him stuck in the past. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean that his mistakes didn't matter. It meant that he could stop punishing himself for things he couldn't change. It meant that he could start fresh, without the constant burden of guilt holding him back. Once he began forgiving himself, Chumlee started to feel the weight lift off his shoulders. It didn't happen overnight, but slowly, he began to feel lighter, more free. It was like he had been carrying a backpack full of stones for years, and with each moment of forgiveness, he took one stone out. The more he forgave himself, the easier it became to see a future without the same old fears dragging him down. But the real challenge came when Chumlee had to face the people he had hurt. The people closest to him, like his family and friends, had always been there for him. But after everything that had happened, Chumlee felt like he had let them down. He knew that the people who cared about him deserved more than the version of himself he had been showing them. So, he set out to make things right. He reached out to his loved ones and apologized. He didn't expect them to forgive him right away, but he knew it was something he had to do. He had to take responsibility for his actions and let them know that he understood how his choices had affected them. Chumlee was surprised by how much it helped. The conversations weren't easy, but they were necessary. He learned that sometimes, the hardest thing you can do is to face the people you've hurt and admit your mistakes. But it's also one of the most healing things you can do. Chumlee started to rebuild his relationships, one honest conversation at a time. He learned that the people who truly loved him wanted him to be better. They didn't want him to stay stuck in the past. They wanted to see him succeed, but they also wanted him to be real. The more Chumlee worked on his emotional healing, the more he realized that his journey wasn't just about fixing himself. It was about helping others, too. He began sharing his story with his fans, hoping that it might inspire someone else who was going through their own struggles. He talked openly about the mistakes he had made, and how he had learned from them. His vulnerability touched a lot of people, and it made him realize that true strength comes not from hiding your flaws, but from owning them and learning from them. Now Chumlee was standing at the edge of something new. He had been through the worst of it, but the hardest part was still ahead. Would he stay true to the lessons he had learned, or would he fall back into old habits? Only time would tell. But for the first time in a long time, Chumlee felt like he had the strength to move forward. He had faced his biggest challenge yet, and it wasn't just about staying out of trouble. It was about staying true to himself, and building a future based on honesty, growth, and forgiveness. This was the moment of truth, the moment when Chumlee realized that redemption wasn't just about what you do, it's about who you become.